we pretty much know that that's going to actually happen. So let's first of all deal with the matter of definitions. That's our point number one. How do I define a disaster? What is the difference between a major incident and something that is not that, something bigger? And I like this definition from the International Federation of Red Cross because it gives us a bit of a mathematical calculation. You know, being IT nerds and engineers by trade, we like that context. And so there's a premise of vulnerability. And again, this total dependence on digital enablement creates vulnerability, of course. But then there's the hazard. And that's the fact that every hazard isn't equal. When I was doing my research for this event, I kind of chuckled because I came across a computer glitch at Starbucks. And by the way, if you want to find information on the internet about technology-based disasters, use the very technical word glitch, because that's what the media loves to use. But apparently in March, you know, it was a disaster because you couldn't use online payment techniques in the real retail stores or online with Starbucks, so you didn't get your coffee unless you were paying cash. And with that, that could be a disaster for some people, right? That impacts your ability to cope. So this is a very relative term. It's not it's not funny in one sense, but the reality is, what constitutes a disaster really is relative to the risk, the detail or level or impact of the hazard divided by your capacity to cope, and that can be very individualistic by organization, even within each organization specific service lines. So it's something to consider as what is a disaster, because that'll be a big part of what we discuss when we look at the supporting mechanisms. So Vincent, your thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, so now that we have a definition, and thank you for the definition, Troy, let's look at what we talk about when we say disaster. And let's look at the different type of critical events that organizations are facing today. And as you can see, there are many. They can be of many different natures. They can be, you know, natural disasters, man-made disasters, or they can be, like you mentioned, IT-related critical events. And all those events can have a serious impact on your business assets, your people, the safety of your people, facilities, your buildings, but also on your technology assets, your data center, your network, your business mission critical applications. And they all can compromise your ability to basically run your business operations. And I think what's important to note here is that depending on the nature of the critical events that we are facing or that an organization is facing, they will impact different stakeholders, different populations. It can be your employees, your customers, your partners, it can be your internal line of business, your application owners, or your management. And why this is important to note is because when we're going to talk about designing the response processes, we'll see that there's not one size fits all, and there's going to be different response processes for the different type of events that we're facing. Also, if we look at the occurrence of those events, some are very unlikely to happen. I could take an example of a snowstorm in Miami. Yeah, it's unlikely to happen. But others are occurring more often than not, right? Like IT failures, network outages, cyber attacks that we see more and more those days. And like you said, Troy, just open the news. Just open the news and Google glitch or outage or technical issue, and you'll see that almost every day there are big corporations going through these situations. This is the visible part of the iceberg, right? So at the end of the day, you need to set up different response processes to cope with the different critical events based on their type, but also on their likelihood of happening or their occurrence. And that is going to be our number 2 thing that we want to talk to you about today.
Yeah, the key words that you just brought up was you have to set up, meaning you have to plan for it. One of the things I like to quote is that hope is never a plan. So without intentional, predefined thought about what you plan to do in these contexts, then the time spent is going to be hugely elongated. So, think about how many times we've had ransomware attacks and or crypto lock, or the reality is it's not going to think about this Uber. We had Equifax. I can't. Every single time I think about it, another brand pops into my head. So it's not like this is an if going to happen. It is happening almost every week. What I want to focus on now is number 2. You see, service management gives us a number of understanding around capability for reacting or coping when the unforeseen happens, the unplanned, the undesired happens. There's 3 primary coping mechanisms, if you will. There's normal incident management. That's something that most of us are very familiar with. We have, we can almost plan, if that's a word we can use, the fact that we're going to have outages, service disruptions, a lot of times because of change, but that's kind of like almost normal. But the reality is we know how to cope with that. We have a ticketing system. We figure out who's first, second, third level support. We get some agreements together, and we have a linear process where we pass literally a ticket like a token to the next group responsible, and there's time frames and there's SLAs in response to that. That's normal incident management. It happens every day. But once in a while, there is something that occurs that kind of goes beyond a boundary of tolerance. And again, that word tolerance in respect to how big is big now, what constitutes a normal versus a major. And think about that. It might be different for line of business, by various services again, but the reality is it's a different type of process. And most organizations, again, will have something like this where you assemble everybody into a physical or virtual environment, all hands on deck. We get technologies in play for collaboration and communication. It's not so much a linear process because it's more of a case management, the modern word swarm. Everybody comes together and they don't leave until we've got this thing resolved. So the premise of how we basically solve that is going to be different than normal incident management. It's the boundary lines that I want to tie your attention to, and then we're going to go on to the larger context of service continuity. How do you know? Who determines? What predefined thresholds have you considered to say when is a normal incident a major? Who makes that call? Who's responsible for alerting those folks in response to that? Now, some organizations may have this boundary line in place, but there's another boundary line because we're talking 3 tiers of coping. Now, you have a major incident. You hit some tolerance level again. Some boundary line is crossed. What then triggers a completely different process, which is service continuity in respect specifically the child process of disaster recovery? And these 2 things are slightly different. We'll be getting into that in more depth. How do you know? Who determines? At what point do you determine who's involved, and how do you get assembled the right people to make this decision about how to then trigger? You see, these things are tightly coupled, and each of them have boundary lines which then go into the next. In my experience in 20 years of doing this, normally these things are actually defined in isolation as if they're 3 completely separate capabilities, and in essence they are different practices, but as if they're not connected or integrated. That's the problem. So I'm a lean advocate, and a big thing we do in value stream mapping and looking at the cycle time of an end-to-end process throughput is that the majority of time is actually not spent in active, quote-unquote, productive time. The majority of time of a total cycle time, end-to-end, of anything is in wait, when everyone's kind of looking at each other with kind of this hopeless look in their eyes going, who's in charge? I don't know. Are you in charge? Who's making the decision? So it's these boundary lines where we have the most potential for devastation because time is ticking. That's very much so now. We're talking disaster.
Exactly, and I mean, to your point, Troy, we see that it's not only the process, it's not only the plan, but it's also the communications and the right people to be involved for the decision-making process. And I guess we all know that communication is key, especially during crises, because during crisis, that's the very moment where time is precious. Every minute is gonna translate into a damage to the organization or to the safety of the people. So talking about communication now, there are some critical events which will impact safety and security of the business assets, like I said at the beginning when we gave a few examples. And And in those situations, we're going to want to communicate with the impacted employees. And that's basically what we want to do. We want to maybe provide instructions about what we want employees to do now, like an evacuation plan, like a mustering point they need to go to. And there are, but there are also other type of events that not only require proactive communication or simple communication to the impacted employees, but they will also require much more than communication. And Troy touched on decision-making process. Okay, who's making the decision to call an incident a major incident, for instance? Who's going to make the decision to trigger a recovery plan, and so on and so forth. So if we consider, for instance, a cyber attack, yes, we want to proactively tell all employees to immediately disconnect all the devices, laptops, computers from the company network so the contamination doesn't expand. But at the same time, we want to be able to reach out to the IT response team and maybe the information security team at the same time so that they can start working on the mitigation of the attack. And that's collaboration and orchestration. It goes beyond just the communication where you let people know about something. So, and at the same time, you may also want to put in place some kind of mechanism, some kind of communication channel, so that you keep your senior management, your executives, updated on the resolution progress. And you want to do this frequently. So for each critical event, we need to think about the communication aspects and the different communication aspects. Who will be impacted? How do we communicate with those people? How will we recover? Do we need to involve a specific team of first responders? If so, who are those people? Where are they? How do I engage with them? Or how do we engage with them? Who else needs to be kept in the loop? Management, partners, the CEO of the company, key customers, and so on and so on. So those questions should also be part. Actually, the answers to those questions should be part of the service continuity plan, and that's what we're going to see now, Troy, with our item number 3.
Item number 3 is the fact that there is a process called IT service continuity, which is a child process, though, let's point out, of a larger process called business continuity. And this is the proactive side. There's a DR response to the critical event, disaster recovery, but before I can be ready, the word setup that you used earlier, Vincent, is key. I need to be in a place where I have thought through my response and I have these things in place. So let's take a look at some of this and how this be intentionally developed. For example, the next slide, please. Let's start with definition. The definition, a lot of, again, time that we spend and waste is not having a common language and or definition of terms. These are only a couple I want to point out just to give us some context of our conversation. So first of all, IT service continuity, what it's not. IT service continuity and business continuity are not architecting for high availability. This isn't, I'm going to create a fault-tolerant architecture with failover and resilience, failover in this context simply being the one device taking over for another, or I'm going to have a disciplined approach to backup and tape management. That's normal practice, right? That's kind of how do we manage to the normal incident, maybe even the major incident. We're not having to completely pull the trigger now and go into a non-routine environment and in a non-routine way deliver service. This is when all normal has failed, we now move to this concept of business continuity and IT service continuity. And back to that decision authority, each time we're talking more senior people, obviously, because the implications and the cost and the risk of calling in these things into play have significant impact, but so do not calling them. So that's the challenge. So some key words from a service level management perspective, right? Failover. there's this process where someone blows the whistle and we all begin to go. And literally, sometimes we are going somewhere else. We're driving to an alternate data center or somewhere where we have a reciprocal agreement. There's an environment we now enter in some state of preparedness. There is physical assets to manage, there's virtual assets to manage, and there's a recovery process that begins where sometimes we even need to get down to detailed procedures and checklists. So that's a time. How long does that failover period take? That's failing over to this non-routine environment. Now, that's complicated in its own right, but we can't not plan for fail back, which is to come home, basically come back to where we were, because now we're going to have to now replicate data created in one environment back to this now standard, environment that we've reestablished. And so that total period of time of failover, fail back represents a significant business disruption. Both elements of that coin have to be considered and planned out. And of course, what does good look like is a key thing we're defining here. So service level objectives would be recovery time objectives. The amount of time the business can be without services needing recovering. What is that? I mean, it's improbable to think that's zero, but what's decent, what's reasonable, right? Are we talking 4 hours, 6 hours? What is the goal for failover and fail back? And even if we fail over now to this new environment, what's a reasonable data set to be working with at that point, right? So let's say I have a ransomware situation, or I've been locked out of all my data from a third-party Trojan attack. I'm going to fail back now to a recovery point that data has been set at. What's tolerable in that context? We're talking again, 15 minutes, probably not going to be reasonable when the cost and the implication of that. So are we feeling back 24 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours? These things have to be a discussed and planned and agreed set of objectives so that we can architect and design our way to actually achieve them. These are predetermined decisions, if you will, things that have to be defined and agreed. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense that this isn't only something that the IT world works on, right? Business continuity, because again of the disasters we're seeing, is a major consideration for organizations and communities all around the world. This is information that's actually taken from the Federal Communications Commission from Homeland Security, and a little bit of a note here. I was looking at their website this past week, and they're saying the same things we are. With the devastating storms we've seen with Harvey and Irma and Maria, billions of dollars and lives lost. We're still recovering in Puerto Rico and those areas. You can't leave this to chance. We have to know, first of all, you can't govern what you don't understand and you don't plan, right? So key things that they would describe that are important. What are the key operational systems, technology systems that enable this community? What are the recovery processes, the things we're talking about in this session? Who's involved? That's the authority matrix. How do we actually make sure, we're saying, John, you're involved, and congratulations, you are the, incident, you are the major incident, or now the disaster recovery captain. Is it just to give the guy a hat? Are we going to train these folks? Are we going to give them the skills and knowledge they need to actually make the right call at the right time and the right speed? This isn't something we leave to chance. Next slide, please. Now, it's one thing to say, I'm going to be counting on Maria over here to be a key point of contact, but do we know where she is at any given moment, especially if she's on a critical list? How do I communicate to people? Where are they relative to status and leave? We're doing more and more with third parties now, especially with the cloud involvement and engagement, and that creates a bit more complexity. We'll come back to you in a few minutes, but now your third-party providers are a critical component of your failover and your recovery plan. So now we're including them in this larger family context of recovery and service continuity. Not all services are equal, right? We can't bring all the services up at the same time. So what's that sequence going to be predetermined and pre-discussed? At what level? We can't assume 100% in an alternate environment. What's a reasonable percentage of capacity and performance in this context? What are the alternate sites? Do we have a site A, site B model, right? So I hope you're getting a context here. There's a lot of discussion and decisioning and documentation and management of a capability that's critical to ongoing survival, probably not something we want to leave to chance. Hope is not a plan. Another way to look at it is now in the lifecycle premise. This is our number 5. And so number 5 says, this is something, we just don't tag on to the weekend before we go live on a major systems implementation. Right through the whole service lifecycle, service definition through its deployment, there are questions, considerations, and challenges we look at. At the beginning, we're looking at a business impact analysis. We're working with business stakeholders to say which are mission critical, which are not, which are ranking in that context, what's a reasonable amount of investment, what about suppliers, how in our contracts, with our agreements with our suppliers, what kind of terms and conditions do we need to have in place to make sure that they are available at the right time in the right place to be the supplier and partner we need. So it's not just sign the credit card and or basically swipe the credit card and low price and available service. Now we're talking about an investment in this ecosystem. To make that decision though, there's a lot of now risk management. That's back to what's the scope, the probability, the impact, and how can we qualify this? What kind of level of continuity? In the event of this, okay, who are the key stakeholders? So it's our recovery plan, our communication plan, and this is almost, actually it is, by service, right? You might have a service owner, you might have key lines of business, points of contact, and so you have this plan by service that's going to feed into your master plan. We're going to implement this, right? But we're going to create tests. We think about test-driven development in an agile sense, but we're going to also be looking at how do we test the capability of service continuity. And so these tests are actually predefined. What does a good test look like? And there's different levels and rigors of tests depending on what type of testing we're doing throughout the year. So we're not always doing full failover tests. We could be doing partial tests. So we're considering about what's a tolerable amount of testing. The environments that we're focused on, especially when we're into more of a DevOps context of continuous delivery and deployment, recovery guides, even down to sometimes needing procedures for configuration of our systems and our environments. That's our transition. Part of that transition is that awareness testing of just going on operations and testing. So let's say we implement a implementation of a DR capability. Now we know the only constant in life is change. So as we change almost weekly on a given production system, what are we doing to ensure that the change isn't closed until we have a full replication, at least the applicable portion, to the DR capability, disaster recovery capability, which isn't just the technology systems, but sometimes these procedures, right? These recovery guides that we've just discussed. And those tests, we're going to see as I show you an example in a few minutes, are part of continual improvement, because obviously you're not going to succeed and all the tests won't be perfect. So what does that do to continual improvement? How does that trigger change and update? All of these things are throughout the life cycle. And taking this view, this process view, I want to come back to number 6, that IT service continuity is not an isolated process. But here's the rub. I often find that what we've got going on is IT service continuity is leading the charge, but it shouldn't be in theory, and that's the theory part of it. In reality, there should be a business continuity process, because let's say we renew and restore our technology capabilities and the data, but no one shows up to use them, right? So as we would discuss the alternative sites relative to the data center concept, where are our user communities being restored? How are they being relocated? How are we connecting them now with rights and authentication to the new centers that are being set up to provide this disaster continuity recovery context? So in essence, we really should be, and sometimes IT service continuity is the prompting of this, be working hand in hand as we look at a business continuity, how that feeds now the BIA discussion, business impact analysis, on the IT service continuity. How business continuity plans have dependent plans within the implementation of the technologies. Again, the authorization comes in here, organization and planning. I want to just go back to that statement. It's not enough to just build it and they will come. If they don't know where to go and basically are not trained in how to reestablish, it's not enough to have the technology. You have to have the people side, of organizational side of this concept going on. And every day, operationally, we're changing. That's back to this whole context of if we see changes in production, how are we mirroring those into the DR? The goal here is to be available and ready so that when the unexpected does happen, we're not caught unawares. Let me show you an example. All right, so if you would, next slide, please, Vincent. So just a couple of things in this example. First, I want you to think about the fact that it's not just a one-size-fits-all. You have options. So I like using metaphors, and so one of my childhood characters, the Cookie Monster, he had an emotional attachment to his cookies, right? Not being there or there, this was an important thing. So, you know, there's different levels of recovery. And this is back to the BIA, understanding that we have to look at the right risk and the investment based on the risk. Sometimes it's okay to just build it from scratch, right? Manual workaround, we'll just start again. We'll rebuild it wherever we need to, and we'll pull out the old manual and, you know, go step 1 through X. But that's not always the case, especially when we're so codependent. So often what will happen is you establish reciprocal agreements. That could be with another organization within your own brand. That could be a third-party supplier on a contract basis. And what they provide for you could be different levels. So you've got a gradual environment recovery. So think about this. You've got space set aside in this data center, but you know, at least you don't have to go find a place to rebuild. You've got a location. It's kind of like the emergency preparedness zone. Everybody go there, and you basically show up and you start to rebuild. Obviously, that's going to be not going to probably hit most people's recovery objectives for failover and fail back. So there's no context here. The gradual recovery is, you know, where you can get some cookies if you need some. You might have some third-party supplier contracts set in place so that you can hit the trigger on the procurement, and, you know, that's not going to take you weeks. At least it'll shorten down to days. Intermediate recovery. You've got a partial environment, and now you have to basically, you know, bring it up to where production was. So you can find a place to go and find some cookies. So grandma's got cookies, we'll go eat hers. So you've got some, you know, example. Some organizations see the investment in the total replication necessary. So now we have a hot standby, right? They've got literally a second cookie jar available to me at, you know, arm's reach in another location. Obviously, you're not going to be able to, you know, afford that for every critical service, nor should you, because not all services are critical, and that's back to this predetermining the prioritization and the business impact of those, and, you know, planning on a level of investment per. If we go on, please, Vincent. I've mentioned the cloud context earlier. So the cloud is both a blessing and as well as it adds a little bit of complication in this discussion. So a lot of organizations are leveraging and are moving rapidly to virtualizing their full environments. So, you know, software-defined data centers, the everything is code context. A lot of that now going to AWS and other third-party suppliers, Azure, etc. Just I want you to think about the implications of that from a disaster service continuity perspective, because it does add some complexity as well as value. First of all, a lot of times traditional recovery solutions, technologies, processes have been largely focused on physical, not virtual assets. So a lot of this virtualization sometimes falls down when it comes to recovery. There's another aspect of this, is now how am I funding this? You know, initially you would fund it out of your CapEx initiative, major project funding, but now you've got to move this to an OpEx budget, an operations expense, because now you're basically paying a third-party supplier to manage a lot of your environment for both production but also your failover DR environment. This has a major implication on your supplier management, not procurement, because in supplier management we talk about different classes of supplier and having different terms and conditions based on the criticality of that supplier to your overall operating model. So you just can't treat everybody like a widget provider when they provide the heart and blood of your key environmentals, right? Configuration management, well, you thought it was challenging when it was on-premise, but where is this stuff, right? Where is, especially when you're using a lot of cloud environment? You could be safe, but your cloud provider could be somewhere in California where there's a wildfire going on right now. So what are their controls and their service continuity capabilities in the discussion we're having today? Change management, this whole premise of not just production changes, but the mirroring and the replication that we need in the DR, right? Software-defined environments, continuous delivery, deployment, these are all good, but as more and more we virtualize, especially outside of your on-premise environment, you have to recognize that you're extending your environment to these third-party environments, and their extension means they're also your dependents. So while there's a value here, that's a potential risk, and so the last thing you want to do is bring on a critical supplier, but there's no terms and conditions around, what does it mean to be with me in a disaster and to respond in that respect, right? You can even, at this point, especially as you move to, everything as code, be leveraging some suppliers out there which are offering now disaster recovery as a service, the complete end-to-end as we move to virtualized environments. These aren't answers, but what I'm trying to point out to you is that the cloud conversation does bring a little bit more complexity. Thank you, that's good. I've been telling you I was going to show you an example process, and so I like this process. This actually comes from a major financial organization that I worked with to set up a process around business service continuity and disaster recovery. Treat those three things as kind of separate capabilities. At the top, this is a high-level view of the process. Below this, it breaks into much more detail, but it gives you a good sense of what we've been discussing so far. Back to Vincent's earlier words, setting up the processes means having a process to look at this ongoing. Starting at the top of the screen, we have business continuity making some decisions. That's driving, identifying what the requirements are on the IT service continuity side. That's 2.A. So here's how it typically goes. So, there's a trigger to basically reevaluate annually the business impact and vulnerability and impact of key critical mission systems. And so they say, we need DR. And so IT says, okay, well, how much do you need? Well, they say, well, it's very mission critical. We need all these things, fully replicated, blah, blah, blah. So, we go out, we price that, and we come back with a nice big bill, and it says, okay, well, we could do that, but here's X million dollars of cost. Oh, that changes everything. And so you go through this cycle back and forth until you get to how much is enough, how much is not enough, and so you get this BIA, really classification of all your key systems. Just as a quick side note, if you've gone through this exercise and now classified all of your key systems relative to business impact and risk, you should be really leveraging that same BIA kind of classification back to your normal and major incident process, because what you've done is now gone through a triage of understanding what the business views as critical and less so. So that one policy should actually be, in essence, integrated across all three recovery or coping mechanisms. So moving down, we now implement, that's 2.B, and now we're not just implementing the technical capability, but notice the database at the bottom. That's where our recovery procedures are, the documentation, the checklists, the things that were, the training content from our, implementing to the people side of this. And so ongoing, we implement it and we're verifying against change management, keeping it fresh. Once in a while though, ideally, we're going over to the left here to doing a test, whether that's full recovery testing or partial recovery testing. By minimum, many organizations have to do this a minimum annually. Unfortunately, what I've often seen, this is unfortunate because what I'll often see is that they won't do such a good job of replicating production in your DR environment, so they'll run a project to update their DR environment before they do their test. Heaven forbid that you actually have a disaster before your project to update the DR, because now you're up the creek without a paddle. But from that, results happen and you kind of go through the cycle again. What do you need to change? Where do you need to pull up your socks? Do we need to go back at the end of the year and have a conversation with the business again, which is yes. How much do you want to pay and how much DR do you need? And so this cycle goes on all the time. So you might be thinking, OMG, this is work. Well, it is, because this is real work. This is a key capability, and people's jobs are responsible for it, right? But you see, all of that's necessary so that when the moment happens that you haven't been planning for, where you do have a disaster hit, you can play to the far right now and run your transaction. That an incident, as you see, triggers the fact that we've hit some tolerance threshold, someone has effectively called into effect the major incident, and then thereby even gone beyond that, the disaster recovery process. Now I'm calling the people. I'm beginning the process of moving to the alternate site. And this is key. You've now had a plan in place. Again, it could be a plan that has subtle differences depending on what kind of crisis I'm dealing with. That was back to Vincent's earlier point. To trigger a recovery, failover, and then ideally a fail back. All of this now focuses on how well you can communicate. Where are they? How do you get a hold of them? Who's making the decision? How fast can you do any of the above?
And I'm gonna say here that I find it very, very interesting that the whole process here, and you know, after going through all the cycles to get your recovery plan and your recovery architecture financed by your organization, it comes down to this last step in your process, Troy, where it says, yeah, to really bring value, it has to be executed following the proper way. So you're going to have to find the right people at the right time and so on and so forth. So we see that the entire process here relies on this final step, which is how do you inform people who need to be informed of the critical events? How do you notify the one that needs to be notified? And how do you engage with the actual people who are going to actually execute the recovery process? And you know, I see alerting and communication here, and sometimes, you know, we work with organizations, and communication can be a blurry term or generic term, and it is very important that when building those plans, you clearly define what communication is going to be used, or if I want to be more precise, I should say what communication channels we're going to be using when reaching out to the different stakeholders that we've identified and who should be part of this process. So again, this is going to be based on the nature of the critical event or the incident, the priority, if it's a major versus a normal, and it is going to be influenced by the speed with which we need the notifications to be received and also acknowledged. It is very important that in those crisis situations, most of the time, sending information to people is not going to be enough. We're going to need to know if they have actually received the notification and if they've already taken actions upon receiving this notification. And I'm going to share with you now the results from a study that was done earlier this year. That's the 2017 State of Incident Management research. And you'll be amazed to see that, and I'm going to show you the results right there, that 83% of North American organizations still use emails as their primary communication channel when trying to engage those people I'm talking about, these IT response teams in case of major incidents. And as we all know, email is just a one-way communication. So how can we expect a timely response from people when using emails? Because most of the time, especially when we're trying to reach out to IT professionals, IT experts, we know that they're going to be, you know, most of the time they are in the meeting, they are working data center, they are stuck in traffic, they may be, you know, on a break, or they might even be on vacation, on PTO. How do you know that? How do you ensure that if you're trying to reach out to the right people, they are available? And dealing with large organizations, another challenge is going to be the time zones. Where are your people? Where are the people you're trying to reach out? It might be the middle of the night for them. And as far as I'm concerned, emails don't wake up anybody at 2 in the morning, right? So again, communication channel is critical if we want a timely response to the notifications and make sure that people are going to engage ASAP. And I'm going to share another result of this study, which tells us here that on average, for the same organizations, it takes 27 minutes just to assemble the team, which is going to have a deeper look at the critical event. So from the time we've declared a major incident, like Troy mentioned before, to the time where the IT experts are going to be looking at the actual issue, it takes on average 27 minutes. So think about, I mean, a ransomware attack, a cyber attack, or any kind of outage. There's already 27 minutes that we've lost doing nothing because we're not even looking at the issue. So again, extremely important to consider the communication channel on top of the regular communication principles. And this is going to lead us to our number 10 item and final item, Troy.
Final item. Things change rapidly. So a major context of lean thinking is systems thinking, understanding the systems context of the environment you're in and living within and managing. There are three key attributes of a system. One is that it's holistic, so knowing the big picture. A big part of our discussion today, Vincent and I have been sharing with you folks, is what's the big picture of service continuity. Probably for most of you, the scope of what that means is probably larger than you probably considered. Right, so there's the big picture. Then there's the dynamic nature of a system. Systems don't stay still, especially when they're so complex, and it's becoming more and more complex. So, any given moment, you have the ability to change. So, your ability to notice that things have changed, monitoring an event and alerting and all of that is critical because it's all about time. And the fact that you see that you've got to change. So how can you know that you've gone from normal incident to major to service continuity, disaster recovery context, unless you're constantly paying attention and you're alerted to the fact that things have escalated or potentially de-escalated. So you can't just think of it as a one-time moment. It's this dynamic nature. And the third component is closed loop. And this is where in service management we talk a lot about configuration management dependencies and understanding the upstream and downstream impact of any given change or implication of an incident. So knowing the dependencies, the cause and effect, all of these three things are critical attributes of systems thinking and systems management. And so being aware that changes happen at any moment and being aware that they are and being aware of how you respond, all of this is critical. This is number 10.
Yeah, and so if I were to summarize here, Troy, we've been talking about people, how people were involved, the processes. We spend a lot of time on processes. We've talked about technology, and I believe that we also highlighted the fact that the communication and collaboration is the glue that's going to put all three together: people, technology, and processes. So I guess that the remaining question that you may have for us would be, okay, so now that we got the definitions, the processes, and we understand what has to be done, can you maybe tell us what organizations that you're working with have done? And, and that's going to be my feedback. Organization I work with, it usually comes down to three things. They have a plan. They have a plan for when things go bad, and they have a plan designed per critical event, per priority, because they realize that during the crisis there is no time for putting together a plan. So there's no time for guesswork. There's no time for reinventing the wheel. Two, automation. They use a lot of automation tools for everything, all the tasks, manual tasks that can be automated, all the tasks that are just time consuming and don't bring too much value to the process or to the outcome of the process. And using automation, what they see is that there's much fewer mistakes being done. There's less stress, because it's not during the middle of a crisis that you want to craft or put together a message and get this message validated. You don't have time. We don't have time for that. So they use message templates. They've already thought about what to be communicating, to who it's going to be communicated, and so on and so forth. And something that I see a lot, and I guess, Troy, you're going to say the same thing. You're going to have the same experience here. Improvement, continuous improvement. Don't define your process and put it to bed in a folder. No. We define the process, we run it, we do exercises, we do drills, and then we refine it over time. So we improve the performance of the teams using a feedback loop, using doing post-mortem debrief after each and every incident, and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And yeah, go ahead, Troy.
Yeah, so it's not a project. A lot of people approach service continuity as an element of the project plan for setting up a new service or a new system. And yes, there's a part of that, but it's not where it stops, right? So this is a process, a larger grain capability. And every time you were hitting that number 1, I kept thinking about that quote in my head, hope is not a plan. That's just not tolerable.
I think that's right. That should have been the title for this presentation. Hope is not a plan.
Not a plan.
You're right. That's what it boils down to. And but the good thing or the good news is, like you said and you explained, Troy, there are processes available, there are best practices available, and there are solutions that can help you get there. And I just wanted to put on one slide the type of requirements that you want to be looking for when looking for a solution to help you automate part or the full processes that you've defined. And again, I'm going to go back to depending on the type of events that your organization may be facing, depending on the occurrence of those events, depending on the stakeholders that are going to have to be either informed, notified, or engaged. You may want to be looking at different solutions. You may want to consider communication. So again, communication, you're going to have to think about what channels do I need? Email, SMS, voice? Is it a two-way notification system I need, or is one way enough? Do I need escalation if people don't answer? Collaboration. Once we have got this, when I want to assemble this team of responders, do I need to know who's available? Do I have some on-call schedule information somewhere that automatically can be accessed? Do we need to start conference bridges? In my experience, having dealt with a lot of issues in IT, we, for example, always recommend to at least start 2 conference bridges for any major incidents. Do we need to have the responders sharing information in a chat ops channel? These kind of requirements should be on your list. And orchestrations. Do we want to get a unified response process regardless of the team and the event? Do we need to integrate with some of the systems we have in place already? If we have a ticketing system, an ITSM system, do we want to integrate with ITOM monitoring systems, cybersecurity system like the SIEM? Do we want to automatically execute remediation plans for those known issues? Whenever there's a known issue and we have a runbook defined for that, do we want to execute this runbook automatically from receiving a notification, for instance? So all those solutions exist and are available to you. Again, the question is how much recovery, how much process, how much solution do I need? What's good enough? So this is again here to help you think about the type of requirements that response automation solution can offer you. And as a final thought here, for those of you who may be thinking, okay, so great, a lot of information, so where do I start? And that would be my recommendation here. The first thing I would do, I would recommend that you block an hour right now on your calendar for Monday. So you'll take the time to review maybe the slides that you can download and think about your response processes. So review your operational response processes. Maybe grab a few people from your organization and think about how did you do during the last major incident, the last major critical event, and how did we do compared to our response time objectives? Do we have a consistent process for each type of event that we're facing? Should that be a cyber attack? Should that be, or there can also be for for each mission-critical application. It doesn't have to be for all applications. You can have a process for each application or for each team. What's the process for the major incident management team, for instance? Or is it, I would say, chaotic? Are we trying to reinvent the process or the wheel every time there's something bad going on? Another question I think it's also helpful to ask ourselves is, how prepared are we to respond to the next critical event? And even more importantly, how prepared are we to respond within our RTOs? Then look at what the different teams, the different departments in the organizations are using. How many notification tools do we have? How many type of communications are we sending to people? Are we always using the same format, or is it a different format? Because that means, from an end user perspective, that means training. Means I'm going to receive different communication from different groups for different type of events, which is also contributing to creating even more chaos. And I guess the ultimate question is going to be, can we improve the current situation? Can we refine the processes? Can we look at the technology we're using and see if we can improve, or can we maybe look at the people and assess the level of skills and training they have to actually execute those processes when something bad happens? And based on all these, it may make sense at one point for you to build a business case for those kind of solutions, the response automation solution. And with that, I think we have just a few minutes to answer any question you might have. So I'm going to ask Jesse if we've received any question, or maybe Troy, do you want to share a final thought with everybody?
Yeah, it's about intentional living versus reactive living. There's just no way to basically recover from a major disaster without intentionally having thought it through. The reality is that most organizations struggle to get here because the tyranny of the urgent always takes over from the good and the necessary. But that's a problem when you can see that week to week we're significantly impacted by these major events. The energy is that you have to make time to make time, and so that's it's not really an option these days to not have thought this through, at least for the mission critical services we provide.
Totally agree with you, Troy. And hope is not a plan. I love it.
Hope is not a plan. If anyone remembers anything else from this webinar, hope is not a plan. I can't claim to have defined that, but it's a good statement.
Yeah, I think it's a really good statement. So Jesse, you have a question for us?
Yeah, so we have a few questions coming in, and just as a reminder, if you have a question, feel free to submit it in the questions panel. The first one that comes in is in regards to the naming, I guess. IT service continuity versus IT disaster recovery, which is commonly used, or do you think disaster recovery is part of IT service continuity?
Yeah, I should have been more clear. That disaster recovery is a sub-process to the larger IT service continuity. It shouldn't be thought of as separate or distinct or even on the side. It really is one of the elements. That's why you saw in that example case study, it was the final step in a macro set of major step processes. But it's a transactional part of that process.
Great. Another question we have that just came in is, question, address the challenges of when the BIA output and RTO do not agree or match up. RTO is realistic at 2 hours, but business says 30 or less. Suggestions on how to resolve the differences?
You saw again on that case study, negotiate was one of the feedback loops coming out of the top box. The reality is we need roles such as a business relationship manager, a service owner who represents their service to the larger business, to go through that series of negotiations to align those two things. Because unless you have alignment and agreement, how can you manage to it? So you really shouldn't be moving on in the process towards implementation until you go through that negotiation and establishment process. So there's key roles in IT and there's key roles within a line of business context that are part of that negotiation. And it's part finance, part level, part RTO. It's all of that. That has to be pre-established because you can't build until you know what you're needing to build towards.
Yeah, and I just want to add that the business is going to always want to, to have the minimum disruption to the business, basically.
At the lowest cost. At free.
Yeah, at free. Can I get a RTO of 0 minutes for free? And there's something that we also need to do from an IT perspective is, again, review the processes that we have in place and use the lean management principles and to see where we might be able to improve the situation, to improve our response time. And again, automation can help. You'd be surprised to see how a lot of those processes are still driven by manual tasks that can easily be automated. Like you said, Troy, you said we spend most of the time waiting for the right people to show up or waiting for a decision to be made.
That's the point I wanted to re-emphasize based on your reference again to lean. Yes, we can drop waste and remove non-value and improve optimization of value-added activities, but the majority of the time, the big pole in the tent is going to be the time between active time, the wait time. That's where this has to be really improved.
I agree with you.
Great. With that, we're just about out of time. So first of all, thank you to everyone who joined, and thank you for the great presentation, both Vincent and Troy.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Troy. Thank you, JC.
And as a reminder, the slides and recording will be sent out to everyone either likely today or tomorrow. So thanks again for joining, and hope to see you guys at our next webinar.
Thank you.